Welcome back to Buddhist Beliefs, Practices, and Debates. We're now in week 6, looking at Buddhist ethics. Now I want to forewarn you, they will be touching upon difficult subjects: suicide, murder, and abortion. However, hopefully this will give you a sense of the debates present in Buddhism, and for those looking at Buddhism in a comparative way. Buddhist ethics has become a central concern for Buddhist courts and doctors who are faced with new or contemporary ethical quandaries, like those of any other religion. For example, the question could be asked, what should a Buddhist doctor do when faced with a person who wants to die? Euthanasia. Should a Buddhist doctor perform an abortion? These are important ethical dilemmas that are debated over just as much in Buddhist countries as they are here in the United States. In this lecture, we're going to take a detour from looking at lived forms of Buddhism and against prescribed notions and look solely at idealized forms of Buddhism, because it's in the idealized realm that ethics resides, and from where doctors and lawyers draw their decisions from, just as they do here. In this way, the justification for the inquiry on a whole, or a subfield of study, allows us insight into the Buddhist worldviews and tells us something about Buddhisms as a living system. On the left, you'll see a picture of Bumrungrad International Hospital in Bangkok, Thailand. I frequented this hospital many times when I lived in Thailand, and my mother-in-law was dying of cancer and was treated there very much so. Most of these doctors are trained in the United States with medical degrees from here. They speak English fluently, and they have a remarkable finesse and advanced treatment there at an extraordinarily low cost. Yet behind all their decisions is that Buddhist backdrop, just as it is here in the United States with the notions of Christianity, with stem cell research and so forth. This is just one example of how Buddhist ethics impacts our everyday lives around the world. It's important to probably define some terms here in relation to Buddhism. We can consider again the Buddhism's three jewels or triple jewel. The Buddha, if you recall, the Buddham Saranam Gacchami, I seek refuge in the Buddha. The Buddha is rediscovered and taught liberating truths. He's the walking law. The Dharma, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, I take refuge in the Buddhist teachings. The Dharma is the teachings to reach these truths. And the Sangha, Sangam Saranam Gacchami, I take refuge in the monastic community, is the community of the noble ones who are following the law. So when it comes to understanding what law is, the first thing to look to is the Buddha, what he said, what he did. Second, the Dharma, his teachings, what he left behind. And third, finally, is those who try to model their lives after the Buddha, the monks themselves. The Buddha was the walking law during his life, and as we've discussed, made decisions and rules based on situations that arose. Before the Buddha died, the doctors say that his role was also manifested in the Dharma, the teachings, which are carried on after his death. Oftentimes, sections of the Pali Canon, this is the collection of scriptures in Theravada Buddhism, are used to explain ethics in a contemporary setting. Take, for instance, the former rebirth story we read of Vesantara and the white elephant, and the importance of dana, of giving. Perhaps one of the most eminent Buddhist monastic scholars is Buddhaghosa. He was alive in the 5th century CE and wrote a lot of commentaries on Buddhist scriptures, often writing in Pali, the orthodox language for Theravada Buddhism. South Asian by birth, Brahmin born in the northern kingdom of Magadhi, near Bodh Gaya, he lived and worked in Sri Lanka, and his most famous work is the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification. He argues that there's a priority of texts in the Pali Canon for understanding ethics. And he says the first of these, the most important, would be the Vinaya. Although the Vinaya is directed towards monks, the rules, discussions are often applied more widely and broadly to lay practices, since monks are supposed to be models of the Buddha, and therefore laity, Buddhist men and women, can look to these models for how they should behave. The second and less important way to find ethics, he says, are sources in conformity with the other scriptures. And here we see many variations depending on the region in question. And we should remember, of course, that the Vinaya itself is different depending on the region and tradition, because monastic guidelines, the Vinaya itself, is different whether you ask a Thai Buddhist, a Sri Lankan Buddhist, or a Tibetan Buddhist. After these affiliated scriptures, the third tier are commentaries about the scriptures, such as what Buddhaghosa writes. Monks who have deliberated on the meaning behind a text, much like the hermeneutical traditions found in Abrahamic traditions, which we might call exegesis. So those that were actually looking and analyzing the Vinaya or affiliated scriptures that have to do with ethics, those commentaries would be the third tier. And the fourth and least important are personal opinions. These opinions are not like those we might have from a street corner opinion, but rather these are opinions based on logic, intuition, and inferences independent of these first three sources, and thus should be considered in respect to the first three, meaning that someone's opinion might be logical and make sense, but if it clashes with the commentaries and the affiliated scriptures in the Vinaya, then they do not fit. These four are the sources for understanding ethics according to Buddhaghosa, and this is the priority in which he gives them. More or less, Buddhist traditions since Buddhaghosa have followed this theme of priorities ever since. In this way, we find that ethics is understood through the trickle-down effect. The monks follow the rules, modeling the Buddha. Then they teach them to the followers. And because of this, the Vinaya becomes a source of constant debates and discussions surrounding contemporary understandings of Buddhist ethics. Perhaps the most rich and most focused area in the Vinaya is the Pratimoksha, the code of discipline. Here it outlines the ways in which you can assess any transgressions that monks may do. If they do a certain thing that's wrong, what's the penalty or punishment? The highest of these punishments is called the parajikas. These are transgressions that lead to expulsion from the Sangha, and you cannot be readmitted to the order after you are excommunicated. Many of these parajikas are sexual nature, but also involve killing, stealing, or claiming to be awakened when you're not. And so, from looking at these, we can know that these actions for the monks should be the ones that you should be shunned upon for the laity. The second of these categories is the Sanghadesa. These are lesser offenses that require a subsequent meeting by the monastic community to decide upon the correct recourse. And again, much of these have to do with sexual interactions, such as holding a woman's hand in lust, alluding to sexual relations, and so forth, or attempts to lead another towards expulsion from the order. These all require meetings in which the monk discloses to the community what he has done, and the community decides upon what to do with this. The third of these infractions is called the aniyatas. The aniyatas are minor offenses that do not have a specific recourse in place. So, whereas the Sanghadesas might have things in place and the monks decide as a council what to do about it, the aniyatas are so minor that there's no real particular pattern of how to treat such offenses, such as if a monk sits alone with a woman but does nothing else. If you notice, most of these have to do with heterosexual normativity. The last is the pachitya. These are offenses that can be absolved through confession during a community meeting. The monk will simply just acknowledge, I did this. And by acknowledging I did this, they've been able to make amends. This could be, for example, accepting items of luxury, eating beyond the times required unless you're sick, or lying. Rules surrounding these 4 different transgressions define and articulate Buddhist ethics for Buddhists around the world. There is a whole side to Buddhist traditions in which monks and Buddhist followers prescribed alternative forms of medicine to heal the sick or to circumvent an untimely death. In the times of the Buddha, his monks were reputed to be the most skilled doctors around, and people would come from all around seeking help and medical attention, so much that the Buddha began to put restrictions on who could be admitted into the Sangha due to particular diseases. He did this because he didn't want his Sangha to be filled with just diseased people and give the misperception that his movement was simply about diseased people. Monks would provide herbs or chant mantras or paritas to help heal a person, and this is still very much practiced today. When I was living in Thailand and teaching at Mahidol University, I had Buddhist monks and Buddhists in my classes, and one Buddhist monk tended to my mother-in-law who was dying of bone cancer. He did this by giving her herbs and chanting over her in a way to help her out. Now, we can go on and on discussions about ways to prevent death, but there's just as many on whether or not to hasten it. And what we're going to do instead is look at one perspective in the scriptures, a perspective which is called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the science of interpretive abilities, in order to outline for you important ideas and principles discussed in contemporary ethical debates. Now, before we embark on this, it's important to refresh our memories on the Panchashila. The Panchashila means the 5 Pancha moral precepts. The first of these is no harm or injury to sentient beings. This precept includes not only the taking of human life, but what we often think of as animals as well. Now, we could say that humans are animals, but in the Buddhist canon, animals are looked upon differently than humans. But animals are treated the same way when it comes to no harm and injury because they share the same quality of suffering, pain, and pleasure. Thus, the ritual slaughter of animals is looked down upon, and butchers spend many rebirths in hell because of it. But the consumption of animals is allowed. This has to do with what's considered to be direct versus indirect karma, or direct and indirect action. If you kill an animal, it's your action that ends that animal's life and causes harm. If you buy the meat of that animal, it's an indirect action because you're not the one actually causing the harm. In the Pali Canon, monks are restricted from any harming of life of animals, as small as an insect, or even destroying an embryo. And that's an important issue when we think about contemporary events. Now, the role of intention is paramount to all Buddhist discussions. Recall the Eightfold Path: correct view, correct thought, correct action. You need correct thought before correct action, and you cannot have a right action without correct thought. Examples of bad intentions include intentions that lead to people's deaths. So, for example, a monk that might coerce a Buddhist to kill himself so his wife would become available would be a very bad thing. Or allowing or encouraging a fellow monk who is sick to die would also be a very bad thing, because this has ill intent connected directly to death. Whereas altruism, a form of good intentions, could result in a death, like sacrificing oneself to save others, like throwing yourself to the wolves, or in the case of Buddhism, to tigers, which would be seen as an act of compassion. In Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese Buddhist traditions, there is a special consideration tied to the use of one's body as a means of transmitting a message or dedicating to it a form of veneration of higher principles. This became very pronounced during the U.S. war in Vietnam, when Vietnamese Buddhist monks set themselves on fire. But these cases are seen as suicide heroics, or at the minimum, valorized for proclaiming and advocating and heightening issues around the world. Starting in the late 1990s, leading up through 2019, over 150 Tibetans have self-immolated, set themselves on fire, and the Dalai Lama does not see their actions as being violence because they have good intentions. They don't express any harm or injury to themselves as they're on fire, and no one's being harmed or injured. So in no ways are they actually violating the first precept. While intention has a large role, actions also play out due to negligence, a lack of concentration, and these result in minimal but still substantial forms of punishment under Buddhist guidelines. For example, dropping a rock off a high cliff and accidentally killing someone. This is a sanghadesa, not a parajika, a worse offense. Discrepancy over foulness of bodies and asceticism are also discussed. In the Pali Canon, there's evidence of condoning death due to a desire for awakening. In the Chanavada Sutta, in the Majjhima Sutta 144, the Buddha declares Channa blameless in his suicide due to his appreciated state, yet this allowance is checked later on. To articulate this tension between discussing the body as impermanent and foul and the problems of suicide, I'd like to read you an excerpt from the Anapanasambhutta. Now, on one occasion, the Blessed One was giving the bhikkhus, the monks, a talk on foulness in many ways, was speaking of praise of foulness, was speaking in praise of the development of foulness meditation. After thus, the Blessed One, the Buddha, departed to go into seclusion for 15 days. Then the bhikkhus, thinking, the Blessed One was giving a talk on foulness in many ways, was speaking in praise of foulness, was speaking in praise of the development of foulness meditation, dwelt, devoted to the development of foulness meditation in its many aspects and factors. By this, it's meant that the monks began to meditate on how their bodies are foul, how they're impermanent, filled with cells dying and being reborn, the dirtiness of being alive. And it continues to say, being repelled, humiliated, and disgusted with this body, they sought for an assailant. In one day, bhikkhus used a knife, or in one day 20 or 30 bhikkhus used a knife. By this they mean that in one day 10 monks killed themselves with a knife. And in another day 20 or 30 monks killed themselves with a knife because their bodies were so foul. When the Blessed One emerged from seclusion and addressed the Venerable Ananda, his beloved disciple, he asked, why, Ananda, does the Bhikkhu Sangha look so diminished? And Ananda answered as such, Venerable Sir, that is because the Blessed One had given a talk on foulness in many ways, has spoken praise of foulness, has spoken in praise of the development of foulness meditation. It would be good, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One would explain another method so that this Bhikkhu Sangha may be established in final knowledge. From that brief excerpt, we get to see that the way in which the body is seen in Buddhism can lead to mistaken ideas of what to do about it. There's an importance of a mindset during times of death in Buddhism. Remember, at the beginning of this course, I talked about the 14th Dalai Lama meditating on his death, imagining his body decomposing and losing his sense faculties. Now, what do you think is the reason for this? Well, in Tibetan, Chinese, and Mongolian Buddhist practices, there's a belief in the bardo, The bardo is the in-between stage between one rebirth and another. You're first visited by 42 peaceful deities who entreat you to let go of samsara of life and to go into nirvana. And if those 42 peaceful deities don't do this, then 58 wrathful deities try to scare you into letting go. And if that doesn't work, then you fixate on people copulating or animals copulating, and you get drawn into that womb from that desire. Now, in Japanese and Chinese Pure Land, there's images of Amitabha on the right, brought to help the person visualize and connect with the Sambhogakaya, that blissful state. Now, Dao Zhang actually drew this painting of Amitabha when she was dying of cancer. And both these emphasize the importance of your mindset, because in the bardo, on the left side, you only go into the bardo if when you die, you're filled with fear or anger, and you move away from the pure light of nirvana. And in the case of Pure Land, Amitabha tries to bring you to a state of bliss so that you can receive the full teachings and become awakened. So we see a very important focus on the state of mind as you die. And this is not unique to Buddhism. Gandhi, before he died, made sure that he devoted the last words of his life to his God, Ram. Now, Sri Lankan and Southeast Asian Buddhist traditions also see a transmigration of consciousness from birth to birth, but less is written on the actual intermediate process. For them, the importance is on living and how to live. Hence, the moments prior to death are important as well. The Pali Canon in these regions and other scriptures discuss the importance of not assisting death and the importance of life. However, there are no hard rules in the Buddhist law books in respect to euthanasia. The mindset at time of death triggers or sets in motion the construction of the next self and the type of rebirth one will have. And because of this importance, Buddhists argue over the prospect of euthanasia because of the state of mind of the person. For example, if they're in too much pain, then some Buddhists will argue you need to kill them because to relieve them from pain. But others Buddhists will say no, because they're in pain so much right now that when they die because of that pain, they'll be reborn in a very poor state. And they were actually debating about this with my mother-in-law when she was dying. Buddhist traditions rooted in this Theravada Buddhist doctrine place a higher level of importance on life than metta karuna, or loving kindness. My mother-in-law needed to live out her suffering, according to them, to expiate her karma. They argued that her suffering from bone cancer was due to the bad choices in her life and in her former births. And they said to show compassion through euthanasia would stop such working off of negative karma. Examples of this are also found in Buddhist discussions of abortion. There's a strong stance in Buddhism on life that presents conflicting interests when a pregnant mother's life is at risk unless there is an abortion. Complications with the fetus are generally not seen as grounds for abortion because the argument is that the fetus needs to work off the negative karma. If you recall from the 12 steps and cycles of the self and how one gets born again, Buddhists believe conception begins with the sperm and the egg coming together. And that, they believe, is that life is where it begins. And thus, if you're born and die shortly after birth or in the womb, then Buddhists believe that you are still expiating bad karma and being able to work it out through the suffering. In this same vein, in the long interest of the mother to not abort because of the karma she receives, there are other concerns and processes that are mounted, particularly those having to do with the abandonment of unwanted babies. For example, in Thailand, where abortion is illegal, monasteries often have huge piles of fetuses that have been illegally aborted but left there to be asked to be cremated so that it can be purified, so that the fetus can enjoy a better rebirth. Now, regardless of how compassionate need is, any monk who assists or even advises in abortions, according to Buddhist ethics, becomes accomplice to murder, which is a parajika, and meaning that he would be expelled from the Sangha. So he'd be expelled from the Sangha if he helped or assisted in any way and the fetus was aborted, or if the mother dies. However, his help needs to be directly connected to this act for this parajika to take effect. If the monk's advice is used by another person other than the one he spoke to, then that's indirect. If the woman does not use his advice for the actual abortion, then again, it's not a parajika because the offense does not match the intention. We can tie this to eating food as a monk. As I mentioned earlier in this lecture, monks can eat food, even meat given to them, so long as a person has not killed the animal to give that food to the monk. In the same way, as long as the monk's advice or help is not directly connected to an abortion or someone dying, then they have a sanghadesa, a lesser offense. But if it is directly connected, it's a parajika, and they're expelled from the Sangha. While Theravada doctrine has this strict interpretation of life, there are more textual loopholes in Vajrayana and Mahayana doctrinal sources. And by loopholes, I mean in particularly the notion of upaya. Upaya means skillful means. Skillful means in the sense that you might need to use special means to get the desired ends. Upaya can condone killing done to prevent others from suffering, and it's condoned to some degree. As mentioned at the beginning of this course, Buddhists have two truths, conventional truths and ultimate truths. And this corresponds to that they see that there is a conventional reality and an ultimate reality in Buddhism. This is no different than the ways in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims see realities from their perspective. In this sense, discussions of life and death are in conjunction with the second form of reality, the conventional form. In the Pali Canon, your conventional life is measured in terms of when you were conceived, not when you were born. The idea is that in the stage of self-construction, the dependent origination explains the generation of the consciousness prior to physical birth, which, remember, occurs after becoming. So let's not forget the 12 links of causation for the self. The first is spiritual ignorance, which is beginningless. The misperception of reality and thinking that you have a self, an Atman. Then there is karmic formations. Out of our ignorance comes thoughts, words, and actions, all which are karma. This leads to consciousness, conditioned by the mental formations from a past life, tied to the repository of karma built up, and leads to discerning names and forms. Name and form is, of course, when we begin to organize and perceive through our consciousness things. And from names and forms, we begin to engage with the six sense faculties: seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and the capacity of consciousness to integrate all of them. And once we can perceive and feel in these ways, there is contact with the sense objects, feelings, desire, grasping, which leads to becoming, leading to birth, but at the moment an abstraction, birth, which ultimately leads to old age and death. So pay heed closely to this causal connection that Buddhists believe about the self, how it is formed and how it deconstructs. Because again, Buddhists do believe there's a self, they just don't believe there's a permanent or fixed self, which would be the Atman. So in reflecting upon these 12 links of causation for the self, when would consciousness be linked to the womb? This depends on our societal, subjective understanding, what we would deem science of the time. In 1995, the 14th Dalai Lama condemned the practice of abortion and the power of compassion. And it was one of the mutual grounds that he and, at the time, President Bush and the Pope at the time all stood together on. At the same time, many Japanese Buddhist schools, especially Pure Land Buddhist schools, see the practice of abortion, mizuko, as absolutely wrong, and in some cases believe this would incur the wrath of the spirit that has been aborted. The monks are asked to perform rites to placate the angry spirits, like the Mizuku Kuyo. Jizo on the right is a Japanese Buddhist bodhisattva, an embodiment that, like Amitabha, has vowed to help humanity until the next Buddha, Maitreya, comes. Jizo is often considered to be the shepherd and protector of dead children or lives that were cut prematurely. Interestingly enough, the practices and venerations of Jizo is a way for women to grieve and mourn for their miscarriages in ways that people in the West cannot do. And studies have shown that this is a very beneficial and healthy way because in Western society, miscarriages are invisible, especially to men, and therefore women have to deal with the suffering and the loss alone. Due to the belief in conception, there are no interdictions in place to prevent the construction of consciousness in the womb. And in fact, there's been a lot of support in recent decades for the application of contraceptives. In Thailand, there is Cabbages and Condoms, which is a promotion of people trying to use condoms. And a lot of the proceeds, the benefits made from buying the food at this restaurant go towards providing free condoms to people throughout Thailand. This had a remarkable reversal of HIV and AIDS statistics in Thailand over the span of 10 years. However, some contraceptives work as early forms of abortion, which would fall under the same ethical domain as clinical abortions for Buddhist principles. Views on these contemporary issues vary in the world more in terms of tradition than doctrine. Thai Buddhism and Sri Lankan Buddhism are both based upon Theravada doctrine. However, Thai Buddhist practices and beliefs are much more inclined towards accepting and advocating contraceptives than Sri Lankan Buddhist practices are, which goes to show that you cannot just simply make doctrinal distinctions and think this is fine. We have to, as we go into the Ling's idea of country-specific ones, to know more. More importantly, these views are in the books, but not necessarily practiced. In Thailand, on the books, abortion is illegal, except for specified cases. However, there are a multitude of illegal abortions. Just as how Thailand is the global capital for prostitution, but in Bangkok, prostitution is illegal. These, again, are examples of Buddhist doctrinal interpretations with respects to life and death. The debates over abortion, even capital punishment, suicide, euthanasia, and many more issues still rage on in the courts of South, Southeast, Central, and East Asia. The purpose of this lecture was to give you a sense of how these issues are debated and what Buddhist ideals, principles are applied when discussing them, such as dana, giving, intention, and the 5 moral precepts, the dual edge of compassion, and the 12 links to the self. Of course, there are variegated stances depending upon each tradition, and we'll continue discussing ethics in relation to Buddhism with our next lecture on gender and sexual orientation. As a reminder, please make sure to answer the questions posted on Blackboard for the week in the discussion thread for week 6. Do not forget to respond to at least 2 of your classmates' answers as well. As usual, these answers and responses are all due before Friday at 5 p.m. You can always email me at mjerrison@gmail.com, and I look forward to reading your posts.